Good evening. My name's Tom Giroux, and I'm on the board of directors for the Forest History Association of Wisconsin, and I'm kind of known as the Zoom guy. I help with Don Schnitzler to put these programs together every month. And before we start, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Forest History Association. You can see our mission on the screen. We have a mission to inform, educate, archive, and publish. And so these monthly webinars are part of our effort to inform and educate people about the forest history of Wisconsin. So if you support that mission, you could go to our website, become a member. It's $20 a year. And you could also support our work in educating people about the history of Wisconsin. It's these webinars are free because that's our mission, but we do appreciate anybody who could support us. So now I'm going to turn it over to my cohort here, Mr. Don Schnitzler.
Okay, and I'm Don Schnitzler, and I'm also a member of the board of directors, and I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation. This evening's talk is entitled The Pioneer Blacksmith, Essential Tradesman of the Exploration Industrial Frontier Eras. And it's offered to us by John Berg, who's been a friend of mine for the last 25, 30 years. But more importantly, he's a very knowledgeable, retired educator, author, local historian, historical reenactor, and a member of our organization, and that also of the Price County Historical Society, and probably many others. We're looking forward to John's talk tonight, but to make sure that it's successful, what we'd like to do is answer a couple questions as you get started. If you have questions as John is talking, jot them down. And in the bottom of the Zoom screen is a little feature called the chat feature, and it's been enabled. Just type in your questions. We'll hold all questions till the end of the presentation and then relay them to John so he has a chance to answer them. If you're new to the Zoom platform and you haven't done this before, or if you run into any technical issues, Tom and I will both watch the chat feature during the presentation to see if we can solve any issues and get back in touch with you to work it through it. And finally, after the presentation is over, there will be a brief survey sent out to everyone. We use that information to help us plan future events. So if you have some feedback, we'd appreciate hearing from you based on that survey form. So with that, I think it's time to turn this over to John because everyone came tonight to listen to John talk, not me. So John, take it away.
Okay. Well, first of all, good evening, everybody. And I'm going to beg your indulgence in case I have any technical problems of my own here. And Tom and Don will rescue me from any problems. So without any further ado, I'll get started here and we'll see how this goes. Well, here we go right away off the bat. I want to first of all start out with the exploration of the fur trade era. The blacksmith was an essential tradesman in any type of settlement that you found European exploration or any European settlement. And of course, by the time of the early exploration era in the United States history or American history, the blacksmith was already a very well-established trade. They had guilds and structure in Europe for apprenticeships and such. And so our start is going to be here with the fur trade era at Fort William, which is up at Thunder Bay in Canada. And it was with the main interior post of the Northwest Company, established in 1803. Now, Fort Michilimackinac at the south end of the bridge in Michigan is actually one of the oldest ones. It was established in 1715 by the French, and you will find there many similarities to what we find up at Fort William in terms of the blacksmith's trade. And so here's some shots of the old Fort William that's been reconstructed up at Thunder Bay, and it is open for public viewing and everything throughout the spring, summer, and fall. I highly recommend it if you're interested at all in seeing anything there. They've reconstructed it according to the structures and specifications of the original fort. Parks Canada, of course, has done a sterling job with these different forts they've reconstructed. Here are just some shots of the fort itself that I took about 7 years ago that illustrate the fur trade itself and some of the iron tools and equipment that were offered for trade or for sale at the company store. It was an interior post where all the furs were brought in from the different outlying posts, and we'll talk about some of those outlying posts a little bit later, but they were all brought in and then shipped over to Quebec and Montreal, actually through the Straits at Sault Ste. Marie and through Lake Huron and then up St. Lawrence. Of course, primary tools were the axe, and you saw different types of grub hose and such. Another area that needed a lot of iron work was the fashioning of birch bark canoes. Now, Indian nations, especially the Odawa and the Ojibwa and the Potawatomi and the nations of Menominee that used the birch bark canoe in the Western Great Lakes had used bone, stone, and wood materials to fashion birch bark canoes prior to the advent of the contact era with Europeans. However, the use of iron and steel tools facilitated that process a little bit more, and they were often more durable or easier to maintain a sharp edge or a durable edge to work with. They need to be able to perform anything from forging an iron nail to hammer welding hinges and axe heads, or intricate tasks such as working on door locks, handles, or flintlocks for guns, which is quite a involved piece of work. Here we see the blacksmith shop at Fort William. Again, a larger building incorporates two trades, the blacksmith shop and the tin shop. It had to be, Fort William was a self-sufficient community. And it had to be. It was hundreds of miles away from the main settlements at Montreal and Quebec, 1,000 miles away. And so everything had to be self-sufficient. And what I want you to look at as you're looking at this picture here is the equipment and the setup of this shop. Now, this is dates from 1803. And the one over at Michilimackinac that dated from almost a century before would look the same. If you go over to the old fort and tour it there, you're going to see something here that, that you say, oh, gee, I saw that at Fort William. The setup was basically consistent throughout these larger posts. And so you see here an anvil, you see that cone over on the side, that's for forging rings and chain links, anything that's round. And then over on the side here, you see a vise in the front, a post vise, and then in the back, you'll see the forge. Those are the basic pieces of equipment in a blacksmith shop on the frontier. Again, a little bit different angle. You can see the forge a little bit more, the workbench. And in the back, the table in the way back is, of course, a table full of all the different tools, hammers and tongs and anything that was needed. And there you got a good shot of the forge and its proximity to the anvil. It was always set up so that you could get from fire to anvil quickly so that you wouldn't lose heat. That was a primary concern because the colors of the iron that you're forging tell you what to do. If you want to forge weld an axe head, you need a yellow to a bright yellow, almost a white heat. If you're forging steel to iron, you need that same color heat. If you're just forging, you can work anything from a red to an orange range. So your color of your metal tells you what you need to have to form and forge that metal. Down on the lower right of the anvil, closer to the ground, you'll see a big iron block. That's called a swedge block. It's got holes in it. It's got perforations in it. It's got shapes along the side, and it allows you to make different things like spoons or sconces for candles. It would have parts where if you were going to forge up a rifle barrel, you could forge that up. Anything that you needed to forge, the swedge block was your mandrel. It was your pattern for it, and allowed you to make those forge those items. You can see that we have two anvils in this shop. It was a big shop, the one at Michilimackinac. We know from John Askin's estate listings from 1781 that there were two large anvils at Michilimackinac. So again, this was a post that was 1,000 miles away from any other major settlement, and it had to be self-sufficient. Beautiful old anvil. Here's the tool chest or the tool table. You can see all the different tongs that are there. That tool sitting on the bench or the shelf in the front is used. It's a flatter. It's used for flattening out surfaces like axe heads or a hose. It allows you to spread the iron out when it's hot and form the blade to the, especially an axe blade. It allows you to form it to the shape that you want very easily. Here's a bellows. This is a leather bellows with a wood frame. And again, this was the common air source. You needed air, a constant airflow on your fuel. Out here in the wilderness, they did not use coal. They used hardwoods, dried hardwoods, oak primarily, maple, hickory, any of the hardwoods that they would use, but oak was a primary one. And you can forge weld with oak. There's a couple of smiths that I know that still do that just for tradition's sake, and you can get a nice fire, but you use a lot more of dried wood per BTU unit than you would for coal. Coal was not common in the Western Great Lakes until the advent of the steamship or the railroads, and that would be later in the 19th century, mid-19th to late 19th century. So again, your wooden bellows is your main air source. Now you'll see a lot of them. You'll see later on we have some iron or cast iron rotary blowers. Those did not come into use until around the Civil War, the 1850s, 60s, and then after the 1860s, it was a much more common tool, and oftentimes replaced this. By the turn of the century, you rarely saw leather bellows unless it was a real isolated blacksmith shop. And now they are using coal here, so I'm going to have to eat crow on that, but it would have been a hardwood coal or a hardwood fuel in place of coal that the original blacksmiths would use. Again, you see some different forging tools, some different objects that have been forged. Here's a shot of the tin shop that's adjacent to it. Put both of those together. One of the first, well, not one of the first, but one of the more prominent blacksmiths in the Wisconsin area was a man named Joseph Jourdain, who was born in Quebec, and he came west. He was born in 1766. He came west around the turn of the 19th century. And he was a very well-known, a very skilled blacksmith. Some of his work still exists. He was particularly known for his pipe tomahawks forged out of gun barrels. And two examples of that work still exist, one at the Neville Public Museum and one at the Milwaukee Public Museum. And you can see them on display there. He married the daughter of Augustine Grignot, who we'll talk about in just a moment. Pierre Grignot Sr. was a fur trader who came west to Green Bay in 1758. And he had married a Menominee woman, and he produced 3 sons with that. And then later on, he married in 1776, in the custom of the country, Louise Domitel de Langlade, the daughter of Charles Michael Mouet de Maurice de Langlade. And of course, if we know de Langlade, he was a major character during the French and Indian Wars, and then during the American Revolution, fighting on behalf of the French and later for the British to protect the Western Great Lakes from the incursion of the Americans. He died in 1802. By that time, Pierre Grignot had already preceded him in death. He died in 1795. And his youngest son, Amabla, settled over by us down here in Wisconsin Rapids, just south of Nakusa, and ran a fur trade post there. So the Grignot family then took over from the Langlade family, and they were quite widely known. Augustine Grignot was interviewed in 1857 by Copeland Draper and had his portrait painted in 1858. This is him, and he's quite widely known, quite well known throughout the Wisconsin area. You see in his hand there a pipe tomahawk. that is one of the pipe tomahawks that was forged by Joseph Jourdain. Jourdain married his daughter. And so there's another daguerreotype that's been widely published of him holding that same pipe tomahawk. This is a painting by Brooks on display at the State Historical Society building in Madison. Interior posts, as the hunters, trappers, and traders journeyed inward, they were far, far away from places like Fort William or Michilimackinac, and there were no blacksmiths in the interior. You were trading with the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk-Ra, the Anishinaabe, the Potawatomi, Odawa, the Ojibwa, and the Lakota. So all these people were trading for furs in exchange for different trade goods like ironwork. So as you went in, the blacksmith was a more remote trade. And if you did have a blacksmith in the interior, you probably had a fort or a post of some significance, and it was probably run by one of the major companies, the Hudson's Bay Company, or its mortal competitor, the Northwest Company, and for a while, the XY Company. But it was rare. Waswagening, Lac du Flambeau, was one such post, settled by the Ojibwa in 1745. The first fur trader to penetrate that area was Michael Cadotte around 1782. And then by 1802, Simon Charette had set up a post, a permanent post. Cadotte traveled through. He would visit periodically. Charette set up the first post with the XY Company. And then later on, the Northwest Company also set up a post too. So they were competing against each other. XY and Northwest competed against each other, often side by side. Here we see a forged axe from the reclamation of an ancient wooden canoe from near Strawberry Island in Lake du Flambeau, in Lac du Flambeau. And this was forged by a blacksmith, whether it was shipped in from the post at Fort William or Michilimackinac, or whether it was brought out from Quebec or Montreal, we don't know. Or perhaps it was brought from one of the other British settlements at that time. But, you know, these were the items that the blacksmith was responsible for working with. And here's a picture of the wooden canoe. This is at the George Brown Ojibwa Museum in Lac du Flambeau. If you're up in that area, I would recommend it. It is an excellent museum. Therese Mitchell is the supervisor there. She's very good person to work with, very fun and very interesting. And she's always eager to have people come and learn more about the Ojibwa people. And it has won several awards for its displays. These are some of the canoes that were made and on display at that museum. Again, as you're going into the interior, you're traveling the waterways. And so then immediately south of Nakusa over here by me is a place called Point Bass. And it was a popular place for the Indians, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Ojibwa. All these tribes would come through on their travels, in their hunting and in their trading. And it was a low point in the Wisconsin River. And eventually it was a place where, as the Europeans came in, Robert and Mary Wakely in 1837 set up a building for a bar and a tavern and a hotel. We don't know if there was a blacksmith there, but we do know the Grignots traded there. Augustine and Amabla and his brothers all traded there. And so the voyageurs would come through and they would trade with the Indians for furs, would be looking for that type of particular place where everybody was gathering. Point Bass was that. Again, you see the common equipment, the guns, the axes, and of course the furs. And they would have humble cabins like this set up at time to time. Sometimes it was just a temporary encampment. Other times you would have a trapper's cabin and a place where that trading could take place in a more settled location. Finally, the Wakeleys built this house in the 1840s, I think 1842, and it has been restored to its original appearance of the 18th, well, not original, but its appearance in the 1860s. And it is a living history site today. Again, another site worth visiting. They have different events during the year, and you can look at Historic Point Bass to find out more about that. Definitely a site to visit. They have a blacksmith shop they constructed a number of years ago, and we don't know if there was a shop on this site or not, but this would be typical of the shops that you'd see on farms, lumber camps, fur trade posts, and that. Not the size of Fort William, but again, something very functional, and on the inside set up the same way. Then moving into the reservation era, after the Native American, the Indian people were being treated out so that the Americans could come in and start exploiting the natural resources of timber and minerals. The treaties themselves have stipulations, specific stipulations for blacksmith shops. Just to read an example here, we have from the 1854 treaty that established the treaty with the Chippewa that established the reservations that we know now in Wisconsin. Article 5 says in this treaty, the United States will also furnish a blacksmith and assistant with the usual amount of stock during the continuance of the annuity payments and as much longer as the president may think proper at each of the points herein set apart for the residents of the Indians. The same to be in lieu of all the employees to which the Chippewas of Lake Superior may be entitled under previous existing treaties. So all the treaties prior to 1854 also had stipulations allotting X thousands of dollars for blacksmiths, equipment, assistants, materials, and so on. And of course, the goal of that was to try and get the Indians to give up their way of life and adopt the European American way of life, and that would involve farming. It would involve settling down into more communities organized like you would see in the settlements and so on. Here is an example. This, I believe, is the blacksmith shop at Lac du Flambeau. It is at Lac du Flambeau, but I believe this was the blacksmith shop or one of the trade shops at Lac du Flambeau. So then once the treaties had restricted the Indians to their reservations and tried to remove them, once that was in play, the other thing that was going on was the advent of the railroads coming through and the logging for the white pine, the prime white pine up on the rivers of Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota. The dams that were built, the camp buildings, wagons, sleds, chains, anything, the horse equipment, all required the services of a blacksmith. And it is in the, if I could back up a moment to the reservation era, one thing I wanted to point out here is that this is the time, the 1830s through the 50s, when these treaties established, that you see the expansion of a blacksmith shop into the interior. Now it's being removed from the large posts of Michilimackinac or Fort William, and it's being brought into the interior by the request of the Indians through the treaties, so that places like Waswaganing and different posts of that size would have their own blacksmith shop. So here's an example of one of the lumber camps in Price County. This is near Phillips. And of course, this dates from about 1890 to around 1890. And as you look at the picture, you'll see horses, oxen. Some of the men are holding pieces of equipment, iron equipment, and so on. So you can see, and also as you look in the background, you can see that this is a rather isolated location. And you're probably 10, maybe more miles out from Phillips or any of the other small settlements there. So a blacksmith would be needed, because if you broke any piece of equipment or you needed something repaired, you could not run into town and just, get it done that same day. That would be a rather involved journey. Again, you can see more pieces of equipment set up here that would require blacksmith services. Again, these pictures are from the Phillips area in the 1890s. Now, this picture, of course, everybody says, ooh, and it is an ooh. This is 23,020 feet log rule of prime white pine. It was cork pine, called cork pine because it floated like a cork, and you could fairly, with some improvement on the river, maneuver these down rivers like the Elk River or the South Fork of the Flambeau. It was a lot of work, but you could get it down there if you dammed everything up. Well, building the dam, building the camp, chopping and sawing, then loading it up, chaining it up. You can see how the chains are used to secure the logs up. And then, of course, all the equipment for the horses all involves the work of the blacksmith. So if you're out in the middle of the woods, you got this project going on here, you break a chain, you break something, then you get right back to camp, which maybe be about a mile away or so, which is easier than getting it back to Phillips. Now, this load is commonly what's called a star load, although if you go to the Eau Claire newspaper, this was documented at IK Cares Camp, which at that time was west of Phillips on the Elk River. And it was in 1892, and this span of horse, 2 spans of horses, hauled this load 2 miles to the landing, to the river landing. So these were dumped on the river in the winter on the ice or on the shoreline, and in the spring, they were loaded into the river and then floated down to Chippewa Falls or Eau Claire. Again, here's the water sprinkler, the water tank. This was used to ice up the ruts in the roads so that the sleighs could travel a lot easier and make their way through the woods. And again, you look at this is a great big wooden box. Well, the whole thing's held together by straps and hinges and everything else that needs to the sleighs. Again, the blacksmith's work was paramount to that. This is Dan Hashey's camp east of Phillips, about 1906 or 07. And the building straight in our middle of our picture here with a slanted roof on it is the blacksmith shop. This was a settled camp or a building camp, and it was then shut down after the season. Oftentimes, if there was more logging to be done, they'd reopen it and reuse it. Many times, if it was all done, it was just left to rot. Sometimes it became hunters' cabins and so on. But the blacksmith shop is that building right in the middle. And here's at that camp, here's our saw filer. His responsibility is to keep those teeth sharp. And here we see some equipment. We see an A-frame jammer. We see a Go Devil and another lighter sled. Again, all work that the blacksmith would be involved in constructing. The blacksmith shop is off to the left there with the window. This is John. Hashey was a jobber for John R. Davis, who ran extensive works out east of Phillips from 1883 through 1926. And again, this is at John R. Davis's lumber company in Phillips. The sleds were brought in during the summer. They weren't left to sit out in the woods. They brought them in on rail. By that time, they had the railroad, logging railroad, Lakeshore and Eastern. They brought them in. They store them under a shed in the summer to keep them from being damp and rotted and so on. But you can see all the ironwork that's involved in those sleds, runners. This is John R. Davis's lumber camp out in the town of Emory, about 1908, 1909. What you see here is basically a city on wheels. It's copied after the same pattern that the Union Pacific used in building the Transcontinental Railroad. Off to the right are the bunkhouses, to the right of the locomotive there. And to the left, you see the caboose and that string of cars that are receding into the woods. You don't see it here, but further down that line of cars is the blacksmith shop. There was a car that was designated as a blacksmith shop. There was a car designated, or a couple cars designated as stables for horses. Then you had a couple box cars for food, for grain for the horses, and so on. So this city moved around as you needed throughout the woods at different logging campsites. So the blacksmith was readily accessible and on site, and like I pointed out before, it'd be within maybe a half mile to a mile from your logging operations. Here we see we're back at Phillips now. We see John R. Davis's power plant for his planing mill and his box factory. They got a couple new boilers that came in, they're gonna put in. That building just behind the horse is the blacksmith shop for the mill company. And that was a building that was roughly 75 feet by 30 or 40 wide. And in that shop, you would have maybe about 4 forges, maybe more. And anything that needed to be done, everything from fixing equipment to forging items, that was done in that shop. You also had a machine shop associated with that too. This is a picture of the blacksmith shop from the West Lumber Company at Lugerville, which was about 10 miles northwest of Phillips, and was another small outfit. The Luger family from Minneapolis was a furniture manufacturing company, and they set up the mill in 1904, 1905. And then John R. Davis bought it out when his mill at Phillips burned in 1909. This is typical of what you would have seen in this shop here, only times 4. Nice big old anvil. You can see all the different mandrels on the tool bench there. Behind the fellow holding the hammer up on the just behind him to the right, you see the framework of a power hammer, electric power hammer. And then in between the two with the gauges, you see acetylene torch. This picture dates from about the 1920s, mid-20s or so. A friend of mine has what we believe is this anvil in his collection. It was offered at a sale in 1968 when the Doring family sold their estate up on the Pike Lake chain to the federal government. Otto Doring was a vice president of Sears Roebuck, who bought cutover lands up on the Pike Lake chain in northeast Price County starting around 1909. And by 1960, or by the time of his death in 1955, he had amassed 2,800 acres, and he had built a self-sufficient little community consisting of 3 full-size log homes, a kitchen home, a farm, an operating small dairy, hog, and grain farm. And he bought this shop when when the West Lumber Company went out of business in 1936. And this whole shop, everything in there was shipped up there, and he had a self-sufficient community until his family sold it in 68. It's where for those of you who know about logging history, that is the site where the Round Lake Logging Dam is located. And you'll see the foundations of one of this kitchen house still there by the dam. Interesting story. Again, the blacksmith was involved in things like forging parts to repair locomotives. These older locomotives were fairly simple steam engines, especially the Shea, and they were very popular because you could make a lot of in-house repairs or in-house forgings to replace parts. You didn't always have to order things out. And so this is a picture of the engine house at Phillips with the number 258 from the Lakeshore and Eastern. And it is undergoing some repairs and standard maintenance, much like your automobiles would have. Now, as things became more settled, places like Phillips or Chippewa Falls or Green Bay, well, Green Bay was an early settlement, but you look at some of these smaller towns in the interior that went through this phase of fur trade, the treaty period, the development of logging by river and stream and lake, and then by steam and so on. And as these settlements became more established, the development of the urban frontier also saw the blacksmith involved there, because things that were needed also for the horse culture that everybody lived in, or the steam engine culture, also was necessary for domestic things, domestic tools and equipment. So sometimes you would see in a medium-sized town, like towns like Rapids or Wausau or Marshfield, even Medford, Ashland. I'm just thinking of towns up along the Wisconsin Central, Stevens Point, Antigo, Merrill. You would have more than one blacksmith in town because there was that much work to be done. Marshfield in the 1880s had 4 blacksmiths operating, and by the 1900 there were about 5 or 6 or 7 of them. So, and that was in a town of about oh gosh, what would it be? About 5,000 or 6,000 people. But they also had the trade of the farmers coming in from the surrounding areas. So you had logging and lumber production, you had domestic work, you had the agricultural trade or the agricultural businesses that were building up. And so all those things combined together to keep the blacksmith quite busy. Now, a number of years ago, when the Forest History Association had its annual meeting down at Burlington, I took a day, I stayed over another day, and I spent a whole day at Old World, Wisconsin, another site worth seeing if you haven't been there. And they have brought in a blacksmith shop from eastern Wisconsin. And it's typical of those found in the small crossroads settlements, villages, and small cities. Large cities would have shops similar to this, although oftentimes in a larger city, let's say a place like Green Bay after it grew up, or Milwaukee, many times those shops were made out of brick or stone, mostly for fire protection, because it wasn't uncommon to have the blacksmith shop catch on fire and burn down. So again, there were different restrictions or regulations in terms of building codes, depending upon the proximity of the buildings and the size of the community. Smaller towns like, say, Vesper or Fifield or that, it wasn't a big deal. Your shops were set aside enough so that it wouldn't pose a threat to the neighboring structures. So here is the blacksmith shop at Old World, Wisconsin. And again, you look at the style of this and you'll see some pictures coming up. It's fairly typical, common style, very utilitarian. Some were painted white, some were painted red, it was whatever the fancy of the time was. And as you look at this picture now, take a look at this and think back to that first picture I showed you of Old Fort William. This shop dates from the late 1800s through 1950 would be about when the blacksmith shops were pretty well done as a common feature. But let's say that this shop is, say, 1900, and you look back a century earlier at Old Fort William in 1803. The only thing different in those two pictures is this rotary blower over on the side that you see standing by the side of the forge. That's the item I was talking about before. It has replaced, by this time, by the late 1800s, it has virtually replaced the wood-framed leather bellows as a source of air. And the other thing that you would see now is coal as your common fuel. Once the railroads came through, then coal became a much more accessible and affordable commodity, and a much easier commodity to use for heat. The Wisconsin Central switched over to burning coal in its locomotives from Menasha to Ashland on the Ashland division in 1881. And as they did that, of course, shipping coal had already been happening along that line, but now it was even more so because the railroad was going to use it as their primary fuel, which dropped the price. You were hauling more of it and made it more accessible. The rotary blower was actually a more compact piece of equipment. It's got a cast iron body, and then it's got gearing inside that works like a hairdryer fan. So, your hairdryer is basically a rotary blower, and you have a handle on the side, and that handle allowed you to control the flow of the air so that you could control the fire itself. And it's interesting to note that when you're forge welding, you can actually put too much air into the fire and create scale on the inside of the iron you're trying to weld together. To forge weld, the iron has to be at the perfect heat, and it has to be perfectly clean for those two pieces to fuse together into one. And if you have either of those factors off at all, you can bring it up to a white heat and hammer it all day and it will not fuse. So controlling the blast of air, or the rate at which the air is going into the fire, building up a slow heat so that you can see the fire there, it's in kind of a little pile. You build a cone up, and then you put the work into the cone, and you slowly bring the fire up with a slow flow of air on it. so that you don't build scale up on the inside of those surfaces to be formed. But again, looking at this shop, what's the difference here between 1803 Fort William? Basically nothing except the rotary blower and coal as your primary fuel. All the equipment is the same. Here's a cone again, anvil cone used for rings, making rings and chain links. One thing that you saw in these common urban blacksmith shops, and you also saw them in some of the agricultural shops too, is a place for the wagon making and, or not wagon making, but wagon repairing. We'll talk about wagon making in a minute. Horseshoeing was common. The horses were brought in. You see the rings on the wall there. They were hitched up to the rings on the wall, and those yellowish spots, the rectangles on the wall, were actually where the names of the horses were put up. You put your horse in the same place every time, and it gave them a bit of comfort as far as being in the shop and so on. There's the post vise, another workbench. Again, so similar to 1803 Fort William. Now, adjacent to a lot of these urban blacksmith shops was a wheelwright shop, because you had so much work. You think of places that I've mentioned before, and you had a confluence of industrial production, wood, lumber. You had agricultural activities, farms taking over some of the cutover, and that was all driven by horses up until about the World War I era, when the internal combustion and steam engine were more prevalent, or often as prevalent. But all these different activities going on, plus the needs of the community, kept blacksmiths real busy. And so a wheelwright was often set up either adjacent to with that blacksmith shop or as an independent business. And here again, you look at the wheelwright shop, and what do you see? A blacksmith shop. Wheelwright, if you go down to the Rock River Threshery at Edgerton, which is a big steam engine and gas engine show, that's one that's really good. That's Labor Day weekend. They have a shop down there that is about 50 feet by 24 feet. And one end of it is a wheelwright shop, and you can watch these craftsmen actually build some of these old wheels. Go on YouTube and type in building or constructing wagon wheels, blacksmiths constructing, and they'll have different contemporary blacksmiths building these wagon wheels. Quite an interesting and intricate process. Now, here are some of the blacksmiths that I've done research on, and for those of you who've seen some of my other previous presentations will recognize some of this. Marshfield and Phillips are the two areas where, and Rapids, of course, are the areas where I've done the most research. In Marshfield, one of the earlier blacksmiths was John Habig. He went through an extensive apprenticeship in Europe, and in the spring of 1878, he came to Marshfield, purchased an old shop, and began business as a blacksmith. The first time he ever conducted on his own. He was always working for other blacksmiths up to that time. But what's interesting about that is that we don't know who that old shop was that we know who he purchased it from, but we don't know if the shop he's talking about was a shop for something else or a blacksmith shop. So I'm still doing research on that. And he worked in Marshfield from 1878 and retired around 1910 and died in 1918. And there he and his wife, Barbara. Oh, okay. So I'm going to go back to screen share. See if I can pick this up again. Help.
All right. So minimize your Zoom screen and go to your desktop.
Okay.
Or your
And
presentation's still out there.
okay, thank you for a moment here, ladies and gentlemen, while I figure this out. This has been an issue for me. All right, let's come back to this.
Right, then mouse down to the bottom and get the share screen back.
All right, yeah, just a minute here, mouse down to the bottom. Okay, share screen, all right. Am I back on?
Yep.
Okay, we're gonna zoom through all of ours. I apologize for this. There we go. Okay, I think we're good. Okay. This is the following picture you're going to see here is John Habig's first shop that he purchased when he first came to Marshfield. And that's shown after he sold it to my great grandfather, Michael Berg, in November of 1883. And if we go, oh, come back. There we go, right there. There's John Habig's first shop. This is my great grandfather standing there holding the hammer with his hand on the hip. This is sometime after 1883 or around 1883. And but this was Habig's first shop. The second Habig's shop, John is standing in front of his shop holding a traveler, which was used for measuring the length of iron bar stock for forging a wooden felloe frame of the wheel. So when you look back at the picture of the woodwright shop or the wheelwright shop that we just saw, you saw those sections of the wooden wheel that formed the base of the wheel itself. That felloe is the curved part of the wheel that fits into the spokes on the outside, and then the iron tire would fit over that. Well, in this picture here, if you look closely, you'll see that little item that he's got, John standing in front with the apron there. He's got that little circular tool there. That's the traveler, and that was used to measure the length of the bar stock that would go around that wooden felloe. So standing over next to John on his left-hand side, it would be, you see all the wooden frames for those wheels. Well, that circular wooden frame on the outside of the spoke is called the felloe.
John,
So John, I don't know if you want to go back to full screen on your display.
Oh, I do. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I do.
Well, I mean, we can see them, but it's a little nicer to see full screen.
It is nicer to see full screen. So I gotta go back to slideshow, and I'm gonna play from current slide. There we go. Okay. Yep. Thank you, everybody, for being patient with me on this. We may go through this one more time, given my program here. But anyway, there's there's the traveler that John Habig is holding, and he's going to use that to measure the iron bar stock. I believe the other young man there is his son with his hand on the wheel. I'm not sure who the fellow in the tie is. John Habig built this shop in 1883 early 1884, when he sold out to Mike Berg his first shop, and this shop lasted, I think, into the 1920s, maybe even later than that. It's on Bay's Bar in Marshfield is the site of this building right now. John G. Cole from Germantown, Wisconsin, was another early Marshfield blacksmith, and he came in 1878, shortly after Habig did, and he set up a shop on the Depot Street up by the railroad tracks, just down from where the police station is now. And that burned down. Both Habig's first shop that my great grandfather bought and Cole's shop were burned out in the 1887 fire that destroyed the business district of Marshfield. And they both rebuilt their shops. This is John Cole. He died in 1904. Mike Berg's first shop, again, is this one. And John Habig's first shop, and this was the old shop that John Habig bought, and it looks like a blacksmith shop. So there had to be a blacksmith before Habig and Cole came in. My great-grandfather didn't come to Marshfield until November of 1883. And that is him standing in the middle there. I don't know who the others are. Obviously, there's one of the young men working there, and it might be one of his sons, but I'm just speculating on that. You can see the different variety of things. They're building the cutters for winter travel. They've got the buggies. He built sulky plows, did all sorts of horseshoeing, anything you needed. All these blacksmiths did all that. You saw all the stuff in Habig's shop. So by October 1887, he had a second shop built further down on Central Avenue in Block 94. And he operated through about 1924, and then his sons John and Nick took over and ran it through 1928. Nick stayed in that shop that you'll see in just a moment until 1941, until the building was sold and razed in 1943, and the Elixir nightclub occupies the site today. So in this picture, you'll see Mike Berg standing in pretty much, well, just to the, what would it be, to the right of the fellow holding the horses. He's got a hammer and tongs with a horseshoe in the tongs, and he's about ready to do some horseshoe work on those horses. I believe the man over on the far left may be Joe Goldbach, who we'll learn about in just a minute. This picture dates from about 1895. 1890-95. This was his second shop. And again, Berg, Michael Berg was born in Prussia, Prussian Rhineland in 1849. He immigrated to Ashford in Fond du Lac County. In 1871, he followed one of the families down to Labette, Kansas, which is in the southeast corner of the state near the Oklahoma border. And he had his wife, he married Anna Maria Hall and had 4 daughters. 2 of them died at birth or close to birth, and Anna died at childbirth for the 4th daughter. Then he remarried in 1880, stayed down in Kansas until 1883, and was in Marshfield by November of that year. Johanna died in 1925. Mike died in 1927. They're both buried in Marshfield. And this is the Berg family here. You see Mike and Hannah, his second wife, and these are his children from his marriage with Hannah. In the back row, the fellow second from the left with the long tie is Nick Berg, and the girl in the middle is their sister Rose, and then the one on the other side with the bow tie is John L. Berg, for whom I'm named. And those two, Nick and John, took over the shop in 1924. All the boys started out working in the shop in various, but William, who's over on the far left in the back, he went into interior decorating and painting. John Martin over on the far right in the back, he ran several of the grocery stores and retail stores in town. In the front, you have Michael Jr. on the left and Leo on the right. They were running the Marshfield Times in the World War I era. So they all went on, not all, but many of them went on to something else. Joe Goldbach was born in Milwaukee County, and he served an apprenticeship in Milwaukee and then was a blacksmith in Chicago for 7 years. Married a young lady in Chicago in 1893, and they arrived in Marshfield in the spring 1895 when he started working for Mike Berg. And he worked for Mike for 7 years, and then by 1902 he was established in his own shop. He was Marshfield mayor for 3 years, or 3 terms, excuse me, 3 full terms. And he passed away in 1940. And this is a picture of his shop. Joe is the fellow over on the right-hand side with his arms folded. And I believe Don and I have been talking about this. We believe now that this, I had this wrong. It was on 4th, I believe it's 4th Avenue, the alley by 4th Avenue. We're still working on that, but Don has done some sleuthing on that, and he's got a better handle on it than I did. Another, along with the different hotels and that, oftentimes there were livery stables for horses and buggies. And here we have the Mansion House, which was up on the north side by the railroad tracks. And you can see off to the right there is a livery stable. Not always was there a blacksmith associated with that, but you had blacksmiths in close proximity. And this would be like your rental car units. So you needed mechanics to take care of that equipment. And then this is the Thompson Blacksmith shop. And again, you can see some of the things that they're putting out, winter sleighs and so on. Then we move up to Phillips in Price County. And this is the village of Phillips as it's seen in 1888. And you see that tree sticking up right in the foreground there. Well, if you look across the bridge and right above the bridge and to the left of the tree, you'll see a gable framed building. It looks like it's maybe painted red or maybe even a yellow or something. That is one of the earliest blacksmith shops in Phillips. It's the back end of it. And you look at later pictures from the same angle before the Phillips fire of 1894, and you'll see some expansion on that building. And again, this is a logging town. By this time, 1888, John R. Davis's lumber company had just started their Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad, and they had been logging for about 5 years. And they had a sawmill and planing mill and box factory set up here. So into this town comes a guy named Gotthild Winkler, and he had been born in Germany, and he was raised on an estate of a middle-level aristocrat in Germany, and his father was the blacksmith for that aristocrat. And so by 1883, he arrived alone in October at Phillips in Price County, and it is believed that he started to work for the Phillips Lumber Company, which was John R. Davis's lumber company before it was John R. Davis. And he secured his position there through the help of the Presbyterian Church. The girl who was going to become his wife, Marie Nebus, came in 1884, and they got married. He declared his intention for citizenship in 85, and he built a blacksmith shop and was working on his own prior to the 1894 fire. And then he built a brand new brick and stone shop with a residence upstairs, and he also rented out some rooms. The building stood until the late 1980s, but by that time, well, actually from about 1930s onward, it had been repurposed for several different businesses. His wife died in 1902, and he married her sister in 1903. He separated from her and departed Phillips in 18 and moved to Oasis, Wisconsin, and was believed to have died there in the 1920s. Henrietta moved to Chippewa Falls, where she died in 1925. So here we see Gotthild and his first wife, Marie Nebus, and we see Freda Amelia, we see Anna Elizabeth, and we see Franz Gustav. No, we don't see Franz Gustav. We see Arthur Frederick. Franz Gustav was born in 1890 and died of pneumonia on June 6, 1892. So this photograph is sometime after 1892, probably around 1900. And this is the second shop that Gotthild Winkler built in Phillips. And it was quite widely recognized up and down the Wisconsin Central line because he had quite an extensive machine shop and blacksmith shop going on. And it was one of the larger shops on the line, built to withstand any external fire. And it was 44 by 64, cost of $30,000, built by the day, complete in all its detail. Machinery of the most improved pattern is used, and nothing but first-class work turned out. He also carries a full line of agricultural implements. Second story is furnished up and occupied by his family. It was completed in October of 1894. The fire was in July, so Gotthild had no moss growing under his feet. Here's a picture of the interior of the shop. That's his son, Arthur, I believe. And this dates from about roughly 1905, 1906, I believe. You can again see everything going on. What's common in this shop that you'll see in a lot of other blacksmith shop interiors is the rows and rows of horseshoes already either pre-purchased that were forged up and just needed to be heated up and fitted, or sometimes one of the first jobs you did as an apprentice in the shop is you started forging out the raw forms for horseshoes and making nails. It wasn't until the advent of the mass-produced nails in the 1870s and 80s that you didn't see square nails made in a blacksmith shop so much anymore. You can see all the stock that he's got on hand. You can see the different projects with the wheels. Here's another shot. Again, Arthur is at the anvil. Gotthild's standing back by the forge. I don't know who the fellow on the right is. Both these pictures were, all three of these pictures are S.A. Johnson photographs of the family and of the interior of the shop. The exterior of the shop was taken by Oswald Scheller. And in fact, if I go back a little bit, this picture was taken probably sometime around October or early November of 1894, just as they're finishing up. They said it was, the article said it was done by October. This shot was taken sometime in that time period, just as it was being completed. And this picture also showed up in the Phillips Phoenix edition of July of 1895. This is what the shop looked like in 1977. There was a group that was working on a photograph project to have a photographic record of historic buildings in Price County, which was very fortunate because many of these pictures were taken before the big downburst that came through in 1977 and changed the landscape quite a bit. But this is Gotthild Winkler's blacksmith shop some 80 years later. Now this shop has been torn down and it's been replaced with a modern structure. It's still a retail business, but on the same site, but modern building. Here's a picture of John Pauser's blacksmith shop up in Price County, Park Falls. Again, you can see how the horses are lined up, ready to be shod. Forge is off to the left, off to our left. And John Pauser is the man with the apron standing near to the horse. And he was quite a widely known blacksmith up in Park Falls. And that, ladies and gentlemen, gives you a flavor of the blacksmith as the essential tradesman on the exploration, the industrial, and the urban frontiers, roughly from about our time would be roughly 1700 through 1950. One thing I do want to point out is that with the advent of World War II and the increased use of internal combustion engines and mechanics and the sophistication of machinery, the blacksmith by 1945 was still operating in small towns somewhat, but otherwise he was replaced by welders, machinists, car mechanics, automobile mechanics, and so on. And now blacksmiths that operate are doing mostly ornamental work. Several are doing professional work and doing quite well with it. And others are like me who are hobbyists and do it just because it's fun. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It was very entertaining. As you know, and we talked earlier, and I had two great-grandparents on both sides of the UP who were blacksmiths. So it was kind of nice for you to give a flavor of what their life was like. Of course, I've read a little bit, but you had the photos. It was really nice. Thank you for doing that. So there are a lot of comments but not a lot of questions, but I'm going to read one here. And then we'll go back, maybe talk about some of the comments even. But recently, Bonnie came across a blacksmith area in Vilas County. There were hundreds of cant hooks, chains, butter knives, etc., all cut down to about 6-inch pieces. Were these destined to be melted down into other tools?
Well, you recycled everything on the frontier. If you go back to Fort William, anytime that you had something that was worn out in terms of the structure of something, like let's say a wagon or a sleigh or something, you would recycle that into either making a new sleigh or a new wagon, or if you weren't in need of that and you would just get rid of the wood or the rotted parts and you would keep the metal. You keep the iron because you had to ship it 1,000 miles in. Same way with these camps, anything that was iron would be repurposed, would be salvaged and repurposed. So perhaps they would be kept. They would definitely be kept to be reused either for what they were originally made for or to be reforged into something else. Another point to this is if you had these settled camps that I call them, where they built the camp or a built camp, if you were going to get rid of those caps, if you as the company were going to take care of those buildings, oftentimes you'd burn them down, and then you'd go in and you'd salvage all the nails or the hinges. You'd take the hinges off first, but anything that was like a nail, after the fire was done and it was cooled down, you go in and you salvage all those nails. So there was a lot of recycling, and I would assume that what this lady found would be recycled into something that they would need.
So question from Diane. My great-grandfather was a blacksmith born in Prussia in 1838. Were most or many of these blacksmiths born in Germany?
No, they were, blacksmithing was a common trade throughout Europe, China, the Far East, the Middle East, Africa. There were all different types of blacksmiths from all over. My background is primarily German, but I mean, the blacksmiths at Micheli-Mackinac were French Canadian and then British after the British took over. So every nation had its own iron workers. Because of the proliferation of accessible iron throughout the 14, 15, 1600s. Spanish, some of these ironworks, you go over to Spain, you look at the ironworks in the communities, the gates and the fences and everything, the decorative ironwork in these European communities. So each one had their own blacksmithing culture. And usually it was an apprenticeship that was served over a period of 7 years. And it depended upon how stringent the guilds and the apprenticeships were set up too. In America, apprenticeships were very loose. And so a guy like John Habig, who served his apprenticeship in Europe, had a very thorough apprenticeship. My great-grandfather had more of a general apprenticeship because he didn't start blacksmithing until he was about 16. And that was served in Ashford, so.
I think a lot of people learned as a family trade too, father to son.
In our situation, yes. In fact, after I started blacksmithing because I shoot and hunt with flintlock and percussion muzzleloaders. I wanted to make my own axes and tomahawks. So after I started this, I started doing my family history back in the late 80s and early 90s. And my father always told me that, you know, your grandpa was a blacksmith. Well, it didn't sink in until I started doing this. Well, then come to find out on my mother's side, my great grandmother is a Juno. She's a niece to Solomon Juno, the founder of Milwaukee. Her father, Narcissus, was a blacksmith who worked in his brother's blacksmith shop at Milwaukee in the 1840s. And so come to find out, I have blacksmiths on both sides. And of course, Narcissus was Canadian and French. He wasn't Indian at all. I have no Indian blood or Indian ancestry in me. So yeah, it was a family thing on both sides. I didn't realize that till I got into it.
And if you think about it, they didn't have mass-produced materials. It was all handmade, so it would have been a common trade.
Right.
Because the demand would have been there.
Right.
So
well, go ahead.
Patrick didn't really ask about it, but I'm going to ask about it. Blacksmiths were also responsible for making and pouring babbitt bearings used in the sawmills. So what's a babbitt bearing?
Well, a babbitt bearing, I'm not generally familiar with it, but it is a bearing that's used for the moving parts, obviously. So it'd be like a roller bearing or more of a what I want to say, it would surround the axle or the moving parts and provide a means of reducing friction. So I would assume that if they were involved, especially in sawmills and that, yes, they would be involved in pouring different bearings or creating different types of equipment that will allow for the smoother operation of that equipment.
I'm gonna go rogue here. I'm gonna turn Patrick's microphone on. Maybe he can tell us a little bit more.
Sure.
Yeah, the babbitt bearings actually is what they use in engines and Model A's, Model T's, etc. like that. They used to pour the bearings, and they're made out of lead. And of course, they either use water or oil to keep the coolant in there. The metal doesn't actually ride on metal. It's the lubricant that's in between that keeps them separated, and that's what is actually the bearing, but the bearing surface comes close to it. So they would pour lead or anything else, heat it up and pour it in there around the axle, and that would become that. If you split it in half, it'd be two pieces, of course, so you could fit it around it if you needed to, but on the solid, yeah, basically the axle or the drive shaft.
Right, right. And what that was done to keep the surfaces, the surfaces from coming into contact with each other and overheating and then freezing up, if I'm correct.
Right, so that it would have something to write on. Solid.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would assume, Patrick, that blacksmiths would be, especially in the sawmills and that, they would have something to do with that. Yes.
Thank you.
Anything else, Don, that you can see out there?
I did not see anything else, so. Well, I guess I'd like to say thank you to John. I think the presentation was both interesting and informative, and that's exactly what I expected. I'd also like to put a plug out there that if there are individuals in the audience that would be interested in becoming a presenter, to reach out to us at the Forest History email address. It's thefhaw@gmail.com. And let us know that you'd like to give a talk, and we can see about getting you into the schedule for 2024. 2023 is pretty well planned. Next month, we have Jim Skibbo, who is the Wisconsin State archaeologist. He is going to be talking about the Mendota dugout canoe, the discovery, recovery, and ongoing research. And I should have said canoes, not canoe. That talk will be Wednesday, March 15th at 6:30. The information for registering is already on the Forest History Association's website on the main page or underneath upcoming events. If you're interested, feel free to go to the website and start registering for that conference anytime now. And with that, thank you again, John. Thank you all for joining us. And if you get that message about the survey, we really would appreciate you taking time to fill it in and responding to us. Thank you much. See you all next month.
Lots of thank yous out there, John. Thank you very much. It was very good.
Well, I enjoyed it, and I thank everybody for tuning in, and I'm glad that you got something out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.